Excellent. Oh, there we are. Hi, Julia. That work, right. Excellent. Now, can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Yep.
Excellent, excellent, good. All right. Now, who's come with any questions? I know that Julia has, but how about the other two of you?
I've got questions.
Far away, Tamara. Oh, goodness, you're in the car again.
It just always happens that I'm in the car when I've got this meeting.
How bizarre. There we go. Anyway, far away.
Okay, my first question is, I already put a post about like how much detail we need to go into when writing notes for the tests. I looked at the back of the summaries of each chapter, and they're like, would they be a good guide to go off because they're quite like detailed?
Yeah, I think they are actually quite a good guide to go off. So yeah, I think the summaries are pretty good. Let me just have a look at chapter 27 summary just to make sure.
Okay.
But I think that would be a pretty good way to start. Okay, let's have a look. The summary. Yeah, it's a good general. It gives you a good general understanding, but questions where you need a bit more detail further down the track will be maybe if you're asking about one particular disease. So I might ask a question, just say about Crohn's disease, and be asking all the detail about one disease, but in the summary might not have enough information.
Okay, so just
so the summary is really thin when it comes to detailed information, but it's a good overview. So it may be okay for the short answer questions, but not for the longer answer questions.
okay. That kind of brings me to my next question, which is, you know how you said you've got 3 weeks before the test, you're going to put a guide of what we need to. Would you be able to put that any earlier?
No. Okay, there's a very specific reason for that, and that is that I want people to read through everything and not just focus on the test, okay? Because you don't know what you're going to get in clinical practice, right? You may get anything in clinical practice, and there's a whole range that you need to be at least familiar with having read it. If I put it up too early, people are only going to focus on the test, and that's my main concern. So at least until 3 weeks before the test, you just need to basically study every chapter very broadly, okay? Then when the test comes up, 3 weeks is easily enough. A lot of people start studying 3 weeks before, some start studying 2 weeks before, some start studying 1 week before. But really, up until that point, you need to study very broadly the whole chapter and not miss anything out, even if it's not in the test. So that's why, for now at least, I want to keep it as broad as possible.
Okay. Yeah, I just asked
because... And it has worked in the past.
Okay, cool. Yeah, just because there is so much content to cover, it's a bit overwhelming, like to think, do we have to remember it all?
Well, no, you have to get a good broad perspective on everything. And then when you get the study guide, we're probably focusing more on what's likely to come up in the test and what's likely to be necessary in your clinical practice, much more so. But we really, like chapter 27, I really want you to read everything in chapter 27. I want you to read the whole chapter, even though it's massive, because there's so much good information in there. You can't retain it all, but when you come to the test, you can at least go over certain things time and time again until it sticks.
Okay, cool.
Okay, I've got a little message saying, can you start looking for invigilators? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
There's a video coming soon, but there's my little message. Can you start looking for invigilators for the tests quite soon?
Can I, if we've had invigilators approved before, do we have to go through the whole process again, or can we use the same ones we've used in the past?
You can use the same one, just email Vardner and tell her who it is. Yeah, again, yeah, so that's fine. Okay, now, Tamarana, have you got any more questions?
Well, my last question was, would we potentially be able to go over like a section, and you can like maybe tell us what, like an example of everything we need to know, or
Yeah, we could possibly do that. Once I've been through other people, I can have a look at that and decide what to do.
Okay.
I mean, just sort of thinking out loud, when it comes to chapter 27, actually, I can answer this question better probably after I've answered Julia's question, because I know what that's going to be.
Okay.
So, okay, Julia, you've got a question. Oh, I can't hear you, Julia. You've gone offline. Can you hear me? Hang on.
If you started your float at 4 o'clock, then we would have time to actually do a massage directly after.
I think she's at work, so
Oh, yeah, she's a bit in and out. I mean, I'd be better off answering her question when she can hear me. So, but she's going to ask me about etiology and risk
fine. So
factors.
do you want to do?
Okay, sorry about that. I've just been interrupted, but she's, I think, going to ask me about risk factors and etiology and the kind of overlap between those two. I think she's on the line at the moment, so I'm going to answer her question later. Okay, so coming back to your question, can I take a section of the text and maybe go over what you need to know? So for instance, if we look at chapter 27, we'll look at maybe duodenal ulcers. Sorry, we'll have a look at maybe ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Yeah?
mm-hmm.
So where are we? Chapter 27. So if we got a question around, for instance,
What page are you on?
it's on page 808.
Oh yeah.
Okay, so on page 808, you'll see a very clear comparison between the two conditions because they have a lot in common and a lot that are separate, right? Now that's very similar to like duodenal ulcers and gastric ulcers, which you should have been through in the last few days, right? Now, a typical sort of thing that you may need to know is to be able to make comparisons between two fairly similar conditions. So I might ask the question, can you differentiate between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease? Or something like that, where there are two conditions that are quite similar. And what you need to know for all of these conditions is what I told you on the last slide, which is you need to know things like risk factors, okay? You need to know risk factors, you need to know etiology, you need to know the pathophysiological mechanisms. In other words, what's actually happening at tissue level. You need to know like locations where it actually happens. And of course, you need to know clinical manifestations and complications. All right, so these are the classic headings that you need for every disease, if you like. So if we're looking at ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, well, what they have in common would be the etiology, which is that they're both autoimmune disorders where they have disordered immune system affecting the tissue in the gut.
Wait, can you say what etiology is again? I Googled it this morning, but I can't remember.
Etiology is cause.
Okay.
Cause. So, so really, any autoimmune disorder, the cause is actually autoimmunity. You're back with us now, okay, Julia. So that's good. So I'm going to try and answer your question at the same time as I'm answering another question, because we're actually looking at etiology at the moment. So Julia's question. Okay, do you want to ask your question?
I think you're thinking of the other Julia.
Ah.
Because I haven't tuned in yet to a Zoom session.
Oh, you haven't?
I wish it was me.
All right, all right. So the other Julia has asked me to sort of ask certain questions because she's not going to be here today. So I was surprised to see you here. So that's all right. All right. So, okay, for the benefit of the other Julia, she wants to know the links between etiology and risk factor, and do they overlap in certain instances? And the answer is yes, they will overlap in certain instances. So for example, if you take colon cancer, usually if you're looking at etiology of colon cancer, it's a combination of maybe genes and environment, okay? So genetics and environment, but one specific etiology may be the fact that you have the condition ulcerative colitis, okay? So if you have the condition ulcerative colitis, that may be considered to be a risk factor for colon cancer. To a lesser degree, it's also an etiology. It's providing a cause because it's predisposing you to a condition. So it's a causative factor. Okay, so there are instances where you have this kind of overlap between etiology and risk factor. In general, if we're looking at colon cancer, mostly risk factors are things like poor diet, smoking. Okay, these are all risk factors. But if you're looking at etiology, you're narrowing it down to what's actually triggering the cancer. The cancer is triggered by a carcinogen. Okay, so in the case of smoking, it may be a carcinogen within the smoke that's actually creating the cancer. Okay, so with any cancerous condition, the etiology will be to do with a carcinogen triggering and setting off the cancer. But the risk factor of the cancer is much broader because it can be one of many things. It can be diet, it can be genetics, it can be anything that can predispose you towards the cancer, including smoking. What else might it include? So for instance, if you look at diet, you could have risk factors as being lack of antioxidants. You could have the fat on the meat, in particular, as being a risk factor. You could have sugar, but that's not going to be the etiology. The etiology has to be a carcinogen. The risk factor creates the environment, but it's the specific carcinogen that creates the cancer. So in the case of colon cancer, you could have a polyp. A polyp can be considered to be both a risk factor and an etiology because its presence helps to develop into a cancer. Okay, now at the end of the day, don't get too concerned about differentiating these two, because when I ask you the question in the test, I just need to see that you understand what the cancer is all about. So if you combine the aspects of etiology and risk factor, it doesn't really matter too much. Okay, but another example would be if you had an autoimmune disease. Okay, let's say you had lupus or any other autoimmune disease. The etiology is very simple. It is autoimmunity. The autoimmunity creates the disease. The actual risk factor for autoimmune is often idiopathic. In other words, you don't really know. But things like trauma, maybe gut dysfunction, they may be risk factors for autoimmune disease. Okay, so there's a bit of an overlap between those two. Sometimes hard to actually differentiate. But that's what we're actually looking for when you come to conditions. Now, coming back to your question, Temoana, I might ask, differentiate between ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. So I want you to differentiate in as many aspects as you can why the two conditions are different. So, for example, location. In Crohn's, it starts in the submucosa, in the ileum, usually. In ulcerative colitis, it starts in the mucosa, large intestine, often in the sigmoid colon. Okay, so you have different places where they manifest. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so when we are taking notes, we should note down, obviously, the causes, the location, the risk factors. What else?
Complications. So with, say, Crohn's disease, you're actually looking at, for example, what complications can come in the long term. With some conditions, you can correctly say death as being a complication, because it is. But you'll find every disease will have long-term complications. So if you're looking at something like diabetes, it may be that you have blood vessel damage, which causes poor eyesight as a long-term complication. Okay.
Yeah.
So you just need to look through the text and see, well, where does it say the word complication, and what actually is it? Okay.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
And also the questions at the end of the chapter. Could some of our questions in the test be similar?
I'm just having a look at chapter 27 to have a look at the questions at the end of the chapter right now. Anything that says describe will be similar. So when you say describe how celiac disease can lead to lactose intolerance, that's good. A number of my questions begin with describe because I want you to show that you understand the condition in full. Okay. Which means you need to really be able to put it into sentences rather than just a short sentence or a few words. Discuss might be another one. Discuss how inflammatory bowel disease and irritable bowel syndrome differ. In what ways are they similar? Well, I might use the word differentiate or distinguish how they're different, but something like that. So yeah, that's good. Explain the pathophysiology of pyloric stenosis. Yeah, that's good. So yeah, I think the review questions are pretty good.
Okay, cool.
Because they're all open. They're not giving you one-word answers. In the e-tests, the e-tests are all basically one-word answers or just a tick or true or false or something like that. So if you do that, that's a good way of generally remembering it, but it won't specifically help you for the test where you need to be able to describe something in more detail.
And our
so what I'll do with the study guide, I'll give you an example of a sample question. Okay, but I can tell you that will be describe, discuss, differentiate, blah, blah, blah. And then it'll be involving pathophysiology, clinical manifestations, complications, that type of thing.
Cool. And we just start from the inflammation chapter onwards, eh? The first week or two wasn't included?
Yeah, so chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 4 were introductions to the course, which will be useful for knowing as you go through the rest of the book. The test will start from chapter 13 onwards.
Yeah.
Which should make it much easier.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so Melissa or Julia, any other questions?
Very happy listening. I'm just kind of catching up, to be honest.
Catching up.
This is
You're
good.
behind.
Yeah, I'm just digging back in. Happy to listen.
You have to, that's okay.
Yeah.
What sort of clinic are you working at? I'm trying to see what's in the background. Serenity Float Clinic.
Float and Massage Clinic.
Really fantastic. Where is that?
It's in Hamilton on Gray Street. Yeah.
Fantastic. What do you do there?
I'm the manager and a massage therapist.
Fantastic. Okay.
So I came in just a bit early so I could catch in on as much of the Skype as I could.
Okay, good, good. All right, so the other two, any other questions on the text, on maybe something you haven't understood well or something that you want explaining?
Yes, I have a question. I put some little question marks on going back to fever, and the benefits of fever. There in the text, one of the benefits was that it decreases serum levels of iron, zinc, and copper, and that those minerals are needed for bacterial replication. So I get that. So the bacteria needs it to keep growing, but I wonder in a clinical, because iron or zinc is something that I would have thought would be used to support the immune system. So can you explain how that drop in serum level is helpful in that?
I can, yeah. I can, because it's being sequestered by the spleen. So the spleen and cells in the spleen actually hold on to iron, zinc, and copper whilst you're having the fever so that the bacteria can't feed on it. And then when the fever's over and the bacteria are all dead, they put it back into circulation again. So you get your iron back there very quickly and your zinc and copper back there, which is great, which is what you need. The immune system, generally, iron in the immune system is very useful, but it builds up over a much longer period. So the fact that you're without it for maybe 24 hours doesn't really matter. You can get by very happily without having iron available to make new cells for a 24-hour period, because the fever won't last any longer than that in general.
All right, I've got to go. Sorry. Thank you.
All right, nice seeing you. Come back again next time. All right, bye-bye.
Yeah.
And then number 2. Okay. So does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. So, I mean, in a clinical context, then if someone had a fever, you wouldn't give them zinc. You just wait until that fever ended. Would it just not really
Correct.
be useful?
You actually wouldn't give them anything in terms of nutrients as such during a fever, because they won't have any appetite. You give them liquids. The key thing is liquids and something to cool them down. But to give them anything to digest during a fever wouldn't be greatly encouraged, because they'd have very weak digestion. It's just something else for their body to do.
Right.
Remember, starver fever. There's an old expression, okay, feed a cold, starve a fever, right? We've actually turned that on its head, because that's not quite correct. You need to starve a cold and starve a fever, because neither of them do well on having food in the stomach, okay? So it's better just to not eat whether you have a cold or whether you have a fever. And that includes giving supplements.
Does it talk about iron and zinc for fever in the text? Because I can't remember that.
Yeah, all you're doing is, yeah, it does. Under the benefits of fever, one of the benefits is as soon as you have high temperature, your body basically grabs hold of the iron, the copper and the zinc, takes it out of circulation and stores it in the spleen until it's needed again after the fever. So that's in the text.
Okay.
Yeah.
I must have missed it. I need to go
As a
back.
benefit, yeah. That's a useful benefit. Yeah. What's the problem with a fever? Let's turn it on its head. What's the problem with a fever? Any guesses? Melissa, what's the problem with a fever? Or the challenge, I should say, after the fever. What are you destroying during a fever, apart from bacteria? You're destroying
Something good?
enzymes. You're destroying enzymes, because enzymes are not heat stable. So that means after the fever, you feel really, really tired because your enzyme supply is so low.
Okay.
Okay, so that's very common, that people feel really tired for a week or 2 after the fever because the enzymes don't survive high heat. Okay, but it's still worth it because it keeps you alive. Okay, so that's fever. Okay, any other questions around maybe digestive system, which is the current chapter?
I'm not up to there yet.
Oh, okay. Anyone else up to it? Melissa, you up to it yet?
The chapter 27?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
yeah,
I've just started.
Well, I don't. There was. Let me see. I have little question marks. I just have to go through and find them.
Well, I'll tell you what, shall we use the time, if you're at the start of the chapter and you're just about to start, shall we use the time to go through colon cancer and polyps?
Yep.
You want to do
Sounds
that?
good. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to start with a question. Melissa, do you know what a polyp is? Because you've started the chapter.
Yeah, I think so. So maybe like in lay terms, just like a growth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a finger-like projection.
Oh, well read. Semolana, that's brilliant. It's a finger-like projection, yeah. Okay, what is that projection? Anyone know?
Mucosal epithelium.
Yeah, so what happens is you have an abnormal growth of the mucosal epithelium, usually around the sigmoid colon or around the rectum area. and you get this little growth. And this growth is mostly benign, which means it's not going to cause any problems. It's a growth. You can actually see it if you go up there and take a look. You can actually have it cut out as well. So many people have polyps chopped out. They will grow to a certain size and often stop growing. But some of them, which are called neoplastic polyps, may continue growing. And eventually, those neoplastic polyps may turn into a cancer. Okay, so now if you've got the book with you, turn to page 804. Turn to page 804 and you'll see the stages of colorectal cancer. You're with me? Okay, so you then move into stage 0, which is carcinoma in situ, which means you've got a few abnormal cells are found in the mucosa, which may spread into a full type of cancer, but that's the early stages, stage 0. And as you then go through the stages, the cancer grows through the mucosa into the adjoining layers, then it connects with the lymphatic system by about stage 3, and then by stage 4 it starts to metastasize. It moves to other tissues elsewhere in the body. So there's like a staging of growth of the cancer cells.
Could a question in the test be like discuss the 4 stages of colorectal cancer? So we need to know all of this?
It could be, but more likely, because we're doing cancer as a separate chapter, it might just be discuss the different stages of cancer. For example, because we are doing cancer chapter later this term, and so that will be looking at cancer as a whole. Okay, so it may talk about colorectal cancer. More likely, it'll be cancer in general.
Okay.
Okay, so yeah, but those are the stages of colon cancer that you go through. Then you have all the usual risk factors which will predispose you towards cancer. So in New Zealand, it's very high. And the reason it's high is because in New Zealand, we have a diet that's very heavy in meats, and particularly the actual fat off the meat, and often quite low in fiber. Okay, combination of that and the lack of antioxidants will predispose you towards cancer. Okay, so in New Zealand, it's particularly high. In countries in the world where they have a much lower meat consumption, it's much, much lower. Okay, so diet plays a very big part in colon cancer, and smoking plays a very big part, and all of these are risk factors. Okay, as is the actual genetics. So if you've got a history in your family of having colon cancer, the genetics is an added risk. Okay. Now, any of these may come together to form a carcinogen. So, for example, if you overcook meat, you can actually form a carcinogen within that meat, which will then trigger off a cancer. So you need these carcinogens to turn the cancer on. Okay, and then you get what's called colorectal cancer, which means you have growths in either the rectum or the colon. Now, if you turn to page 802 and look at the concept map there, you'll see that in order to even get a polyp, you need to have the genes and environment as a combination to produce a polyp. And a polyp in itself may be quite benign, but it may grow, and if it grows, it becomes a malignant colorectal cancer. And when that happens, particularly once you get to, say, stage 3, you start to get lots of signs like invasion of the gut wall. You may get bleeding. So one of the signs will be bleeding in the stool. You may get pain because you've got distension pushing out into the colon wall. And eventually it may metastasize to the liver or the lungs. Additionally, you may get anemia and fatigue because there's often a lot of bleeding that happens along the colon. So if you look at figure 27.3, you'll see the actual locations where you can get colon cancer. And that can be anywhere from the ascending colon round to the rectum. Okay. So yeah.
Because under the pathophysiology for polyps, it doesn't really. I'm just curious, what actually is the pathophysiology of how a polyp starts?
Well, this chapter doesn't really go into it very much, but the chapter on cancer does.
Okay.
Okay. The actual pathophysiology of all cancers is that there has to be a gene that's actually turned on, called an oncogene. So you have to have an oncogene being turned on. That's the first thing. And very often you have to have other genes, which are tumor suppressor genes, being turned off. Okay, in other words, you have to have an on gene and an off gene. And between them, if those genes are triggered, you've got a cancer. Now, it doesn't really go into that in this chapter. But what you need is, you need a carcinogen which turns on these genes. And that's the pathophysiology.
And even, what about just the benign polyps? Just ones that don't become cancerous?
Well, even that's an abnormality. Even though it's causing you no sort of ill effect, it shouldn't be in your body. Like, I wouldn't want to be sitting here thinking I've got polyps inside me, okay? Because they shouldn't be there in the first place. But they don't seem to cause any harm, mostly. So, although we don't classify them as being a disease as such, many people think that they are, because they're an abnormality within the body. Something that shouldn't be there.
So Phil, back to our notes. We need to know causes, risk factors, location, complications. What else?
Clinical manifestations and the mechanisms. So the pathophysiological mechanisms are, how does this process actually take effect? Okay. So in the case of cancer, it's what I've just been telling you about. It's there has to be a carcinogen that triggers a gene to develop cancer. That's the pathophysiological mechanism.
Okay, but we haven't learned that yet, have we?
You haven't learned that, so you don't need to worry about that for cancer.
Yeah, I was going to say, because some of them in the chapter don't have a clear mechanism, like this one, for example. So where in the text it's not very clear, we just would really focus on the mechanisms that obviously are outlined in the text.
Yeah, literally follow the mechanisms that are in the text. So it may be clearer for other disorders. In this chapter, it's perfectly clear for other conditions. But because there is a separate cancer chapter, it's not so clear for cancer as such. So for instance, when you look under Crohn's disease, it says pathophysiology. And there's a very clear process of about 7 or 8 lines, probably a bit more than that, that goes through what's actually happening in Crohn's disease. So it says where it begins in the intestinal submucosa, it says how it spreads, and it describes what's actually happening in the process. So activated neutrophils and macrophages, etc., creating inflammation. That's the mechanism. Yeah, so you do need to know that.
Phil, I've got another question, but it's not so related.
Doesn't matter.
What do you think of coronavirus?
I love it. Well, I guess we'll be covering viruses in a couple of weeks' time. I'm not particularly worried about it. I mean, everyone else is, but I'm not. I think it's slowing down in China. It'll do the same in every other country. So it's got a natural lifespan. It's only not going to slow down in countries if they don't take sort of precautionary actions. It seems like countries like Italy and Iran have been really slow. But in New Zealand, you know, we're doing all the right things. I doubt it's going to be that serious here at all. I don't think people need to overly worry about it.
Yeah, in Hong Kong, we only have 100 cases still in Hong Kong. So.
Oh, of course, you're in Hong Kong, aren't you? Yeah. So even in Hong Kong, it's probably slowing down now. So China, it's slowing down. Hong Kong, it's slowing down. In other countries, it may be speeding up, but then it will get to a plateau and slow down. And I think as soon as you see countries like Italy and Iran slowing down, I think all the worry's over, because it just shows that we can control it. The Chinese have shown they can control it. It's been slowing down for the last couple of weeks.
How come it's been blowing up so much when the flu kills so many more people?
I don't think the flu kills more people. I think the flu kills a little bit less. But in terms of totality, the flu kills more. But with flu, it's maybe 0.2, 0.5%. With coronavirus, it's about 2%. So it's a slightly higher percentage that kills people. But really, if you look at who it kills, it's really older people and people who've got some sort of immunocompromisation.
And the doctor who exposed it, who's 39.
Yeah, that was very unfortunate. And he was quite young, but he probably had a massive exposure to it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that can happen. But I'm not worried about it. I mean, it'll affect us in New Zealand for about another month, and then it'll start diminishing. So it'll probably, if I'm a gambling man, I'd say in New Zealand it'll be up to about 10 or 15, and I think it'll start going down. It's a 3 at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But there will be some development because the 2 people who have come in most recently have been exposed to other people. There's bound to be some downstream effect of that. But as less and less people come into the country with the condition, it should be fine, he says. Touch wood. We'll see. We'll see. But just take lots of precautions just in case. But you know, I'm not too concerned about it. How about you? Are you?
Not really. I'm flying back to Melbourne on the weekend, and I'm like, do I need a mask? It probably won't do much.
You're flying
anyway.
from where?
From New Zealand.
Oh, so you're in New Zealand now? Okay, back to Melbourne. I mean, you should take a mask just to be safe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't, but I think you should.
Thanks, Phil.
You do have to be concerned about those people in the seats in front and the seats behind and beside you. So on the very small chance they have it, you're likely to get it because you're sitting right next to them. So that's why you need a mask.
Okay, noted. Tick.
But you should be okay, but you never know.
Yeah.
Okay, any other queries in the last few minutes?
No, I have one. It's a bit more therapeutics, but it's kind of physiology as well with gastritis.
Yeah.
Also because I have a friend with this actually at the moment, and her doctor is putting her on a PPI. And so I'm curious about she seems to have not enough HCl. So I'm curious why the go-to is a PPI when...
It shouldn't be with gastritis. Gastritis, if it's in a younger person, should do its time, and it should resolve without taking anything. If it's in a younger person. If it's in an older person, it's a natural process of atrophy of the top layer of the mucosa. So in neither condition will I be using a PPI because that's going to reduce the hydrochloric acid, and that's going to affect everything from there onwards in the digestive tract. It'll affect digestion and absorption further into the digestive tract. So
what's PPI?
Things like Losec, it's a proton pump inhibitor, which prevents hydrochloric acid being made in the stomach. You need hydrochloric acid to kill off bugs. You need hydrochloric acid to help digest foods, especially protein. So PPIs are generally, they're good at reducing acid reflux, but they're not good when it comes to everything else. So if there's no acid reflux, I can't see any point at all.
No, I mean, she also has pernicious anemia, and so I just found it. Yeah, she was in, and they've gone in and found that the parietal cells have been damaged, so she's not producing any further you know, any further kind of HCl. So I found it interesting that they put her on, or are trying to put her on a PPI, because what would be the risk of her taking, say, HCl or a bitter?
I don't know enough about the individual case, because I don't really know why the doctor's done what they've done. Taking a bitter would probably be quite safe and maybe a good thing to do. Taking hydrochloric acid itself, I don't recommend, because especially if she's got gastritis, that's going to exacerbate it. So taking hydrochloric acid is not a good idea, but taking bitter herbs generally is quite safe.
Where does it say somewhere about this in the text? Because the HCl is ringing a bell, but I don't know.
Oh no, sorry. It's I was just reading under gastritis. Then it just it made me think about, because it just talks about the chronic atrophic gastritis, which just made me think about my friend, because
Yeah.
I really like, I'm just on a side note, I really like how pathophysiology and therapeutics are aligned. It's really helpful that you're doing digestive system and then therapeutics is also doing the same. That makes it.
Yeah, it is good. I mean, Stacey and I talk to each other, so we know what each other's doing. It's not always aligned, but it's aligned as much as we can up to a point. But it is right now, which is good. All right. If you're happy to end at that point, it's now 3 o'clock. Unless you've got any further questions.
No, thank you so much.
That's good, Phil. Thank you.
Excellent, Amana. Okay, Melissa. We'll see you both next time, 2 weeks' time.
Yep. See you then.
Bye.
See you then. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.